Thank you for that wonderful introduction. As you can tell, I have a short attention span. My career has spanned way too many things. I'm not sure if Rachel Carson would be proud or not, but I try, and I've been inspired by her immensely as I've been inspired by being here at Elon University. I want to talk in our time together as best I can about some of the connections I've found while I've been on campus between Elon's, I'm going to use one note, main themes: engaged learning, inspired leaders, and global citizens, mixed with sustainability and a campus that is so green it's frightening. For a minute I thought I was at Middlebury in Vermont or something. Oh, I can't make references to other colleges, I'm terribly sorry. But as I've gone around and seen the solar arrays and the Loy Farm, met with people in sustainability, and of course, I had the privilege of having a lunch and a discussion with President Lambert, Provost House, who it is not the case at every college and university that there is leadership from the top as well as concern from the bottom about creating a place that not only will engage you in learning and in the world, but also be a beacon, a symbol of how we can build institutions, and in this case of higher learning, that will be a model for the rest of our society. And so modeling that kind of behavior is something that I think Elon should be very proud of, and I have frankly been inspired being on your campus. There's some interesting, perhaps weird connections between Elon, myself, and Rachel Carson. That is, I think you know, that Elon was started as Elon College in 1889 by the Christian Church, later the United Church of Christ, and now a more inclusive and generally, I would say, spiritually driven, value-driven college. And it is that underpinning on which your current leaders and faculty and you stand that has given the set of values, I think, that lead to sustainability, care for the environment, care about your world. They have religious roots. We may not proclaim it by particular faiths, but the people who imagined and then built Elon, and through its sometimes difficult history, had a vision of how they could connect up others and a sense of responsibility, social responsibility. As it turns out, and I have been inspired by Rachel Carson, whether or not we don't know what she'll think of us, but she similarly developed an ethic, a way of living, a way of being that includes engaged learning, inspired leadership, global citizenship that came, first of all, from her mother, Maria McClain Carson, whose father was a Presbyterian minister, a learned man, not only in terms of theology, but also great learning, which he poured into his daughter, Maria McClain, who was a kind of genius, I would say. Rachel Carson's mother, this is late 19th century, Elon is just starting, and in Pittsburgh, where Rachel Carson was from, her mom went to the Washington Female Seminary. That's as high and as fine an education as you could get in the state of Pennsylvania for women at the time. She studied rhetoric, Greek, Latin, history, math, science. She was not only the top of the class, She was so good, they allowed her to take courses at the contiguous men's college, Washington College, which was a real college right next door. Later they merged, and now it's Washington and Jefferson College. But picture the religious, social responsibility, learning roots that come from a Presbyterian grandfather to a mom directly to Rachel Carson, because some of you younger women may not realize this, but given all that learning that Maria Carson had, there was only one profession open to women at that time: professional teacher. But what's different than our time, as soon as Maria Carson had children, that's it. She wasn't a single mom, she wasn't promiscuous, she hadn't had moral turpitude, she simply got married and you had to stop. It was not appropriate for a married woman to be in the classroom. And so she took all of that learning, all of that passion, all of that concern for others, for nature, for creatures, and poured it into her youngest, brightest, and frankly, favorite child, Rachel Carson. They ran around in the woods outside their home. It was a farm. They were poor. Dad tried to sell insurance. He was usually on the road. He was not very good at it. And so Rachel Carson grew up poor in terms of finances, but rich in terms of what was being given to her in engaged learning. At age 4, you can see handmade books that she made with stories about the birds, about Mr. and Mrs. Wren, and drawing the birdhouses and having them converse with themselves, the little wrens. By age 11, she had entered a writing contest for St. Nicholas magazine, the most popular magazine of its day. She won a silver medal for writing at age 11, writing about the birds and nature. And when she went off to college, Pennsylvania College for Women, now Chatham University, she was an English major. And some of my inspiration from Rachel comes from the fact that I have a Presbyterian minister grandfather. He's now singing for God's choir in the sky. But I am always tempted when I get into a chapel-like venue like this with the organ ready to play. When we finish tonight, we're going to have the organ play. I'm going to ask you to come on up front and commit your lives to the environment and ecology. But what I gained, as I think Rachel Carson did, was the sense that all of God's creation was sacred, and that included the little animals, the fish in the sea, and of course our fellow human beings, and that we had a responsibility, a duty, as a Presbyterian grandfather would have said, to care for these things and to act on them. And I think that is really part of the origins, both of Elon and of Rachel Carson, and now, since I've been inspired by her, my new role as the head of the Rachel Carson Council, which is a national environmental and health organization that when Rachel Carson was writing Silent Spring, you may know she was dying of breast cancer. She wanted an organization to go on after she died. She wanted to have a legacy. And so her closest friends and colleagues formed the Rachel Carson Council in 1965 when she died. Only 2 women have run it before me. Hence, I'm feeling a little inadequate about this task. Someone looked at me and said, "I knew Rachel Carson and you are not she." But I do my best. But in terms of the ethic and the overall sense of responsibility, I shared that, and like Rachel, I was an English major. When she went off to Chatham, Pennsylvania College for Women, she was an English major. She knew she wanted to be a writer. She was certain she wanted to be a writer. And her favorite professor was a woman named Grace Croft, who was an inspirational and inspired teacher, the James P. Elder of her day. You're allowed to laugh, Jim. But as it turned out, and she wrote for the college paper, she wrote essays, she wrote all sorts of things. But then an even more inspiring professor came along, a woman of style and inspiration and brilliant learning, a biologist named Mary Scott Skinker. And of course, Rachel fell under her thrall and was introduced to further learning, in which she, through Mary, went off to the Woods Hole Biological Laboratory in Cape Cod and became interested in the oceans. She had already had a taste for the ocean because she was a literature major. You may be surprised that she had always wanted to write about and talk about the sea, and this is a test for English majors. She first imagined the sea from Alfred Lord Tennyson's Locksley Hall. Pittsburgh is not near the sea. I know you're all from North Carolina where the shore is right over there, but she had to imagine and feel these things. And that combination of imagination, of feeling, of the ability to see and feel and touch things that are not near you, mixed with the science she was beginning to learn at Woods Hole, and then she went to Johns Hopkins Graduate School in biology and worked with the greatest biologists of the time. That combination of writing, of feeling, of impeccable science, and of strong social responsibility based in classic religious, ethical values is what gave us, I believe, a Rachel Carson. Note that as she's moving along in all of this, she is constantly learning, imagining, feeling. She also was so engaged that as she began to write about the oceans, she actually put on a diving helmet and dove. I don't mean scuba. We're talking the big old copper helmet and the big suit and all that sort of stuff going down. I wouldn't go near one of those things. But Rachel wanted to know so badly about the ocean that she would undertake these dives. She loved North Carolina, by the way, I have to tell you. Her very first book, Under the Seawind, published in 1941, it is the most beautiful and moving and brilliant book about ocean life I believe you will ever read. She had 3 big bestsellers on the oceans. This one came out in 1941, but World War II eclipsed it. She wrote a huge bestseller in 1951, The Sea Around Us, that I heard about from my mom. When I was little, so I used to confuse Rachel Carson with Anne Murrow Lindbergh. For more mature members of the audience, you may have heard of some of these people, but for me, I just knew there was somebody who wrote about the oceans. And of course, you know that there is a Rachel Carson Refuge over near Beaufort. That's where she came, that's where she studied, that's where she wrote. She came many, many times. She went to Nag's Head, she was on the Outer Banks. I'm from Long Island. I never figured out why she didn't drive north to Long Island. The beaches are perfectly fine there. I mean, what's with this going to North Carolina? But she also, using that imagination, I thought I would just give you one little taste of some of her writing. I've got to be conscious of time here, but this is, since we're not far from the ocean here in North Carolina, imagine this sensitive, brilliant, younger woman, English major, imaginative, almost religious feeling for nature and impeccable science, would go and lie on the shore at night and listen to the sounds. She'd get out a flashlight and search and watch the fiddler crabs. and imagine what was happening with the creatures that she was dimly hearing or that might be passing by. She began to identify with them. It's very unscientific. We're not supposed to anthropomorphize, turn animals into creatures. But when she wrote this book, which again is based on oceanographic research, impeccable science, but listen, picture Rachel lying at night, listening, right near here. The island lay in shadows, only a little deeper than those that were swiftly stealing across the Sound from the east. On its western shore, the wet sand of the narrow beach caught the same reflection of palely gleaming sky that laid a bright path across the water, from island beach to horizon. Both water and sand were the color of steel, overlaid with the sheen of silver, so that it was hard to say where the water ended and land began, although it was a small island, so small that a gull might have flown across it with a score of wing beats. Night had already come to its northern and eastern end. Here the marsh grasses waded boldly out into dark water, and shadows lay thick among the low-growing cedars and yopons. With the dusk, a strange bird came to the island from its nesting grounds on the outer banks. Its wings were pure black, and from tip to tip their spread was more than the length of a man's arm. It flew steadily and without haste across the Sound, its progress as measured and as meaningful as that of the shadows which little by little were dulling the bright water path. The bird was called ringcops, the black skimmer. We follow ringcops as a being, as someone has to escape predators. We follow Scomber the eel from the Sargasso Sea, caring and feeling and touching and imagining these creatures. Rachel Carson said that if we simply had science without wonder, imagination, and awe, it would be extremely dangerous. That pure science alone, technology, not bound inextricably to this kind of feeling and wonder and spiritual feeling, would lead to the problems that she saw in her day. Of course, writing in the 1950s and early 1960s that included burning rivers, pollution that you could barely breathe in, open-air nuclear testing of weapons, the threat that they would go off around the world. Some pretty serious problems that caused my generation to even dislike trains. But that led her to become more and more involved, these problems, with some serious issues. She is best known for Silent Spring, and you look like a pretty smart audience here, but help me. Some of you mustn't know who Rachel Carson is. Who's never really heard? If I gave a test, pop quiz, you have to write several paragraphs on who is Rachel Carson and what is her importance. Who doesn't know much? Help me here. This is good. This is the right answer. Normally, I do Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Anyone? Bueller? Who is Rachel Carson? I know, don't chuckle, it gets worse. However, she's best known for Silent Spring. It is an expose, frankly, of the pesticide business. DDT, dieldrin, aldrin, heptachlor, all of these chemicals were sprayed widely across the nation without regard to what might happen down below. As a boy, I ran behind DDT trucks on Long Island. It was sprayed everywhere. In the South, it was used to try and kill fire ants. all over the nation, gypsy moths, mosquitoes, anything that moved was a subject for that. Interestingly, Rachel Carson had been aware of this in 1945. Some of you know that DDT was the miracle chemical from World War II. How many of you guys watch the History Channel that I call the bombing channel? It's sort of a guy thing. Oh, I'm sorry if you're wrong gender. But you turn it on or it's channel surf by every night and it's just, but Hitler always loses, which is okay. It's a good thing, is what I should, not just okay. In Italy, Anzio, we land, etc. There's fighting. Unfortunately, the poor Italian peasants, they're all crammed together. They're refugees. They're getting typhus. Our GIs are subject to typhus. Spray with DDT, miracle life-saving chemical. South Pacific. My uncle was in Guadalcanal. He went to Furman, I'm sorry to say, not to Elon. However, he was wounded and fortunately survived and came back from Guadalcanal. Sprayed routinely with DDT to prevent malaria, to kill the mosquitoes. These chemicals saved large numbers of civilian and American GI and Marine lives. When the war ended, guess what? No market. Companies like DuPont and others who were manufacturing them needed to sell them. They had, it was a pretty big, hefty investment in producing DDT. And so we partly marketed and created a war at home. You would see ads with little bugs with a Hitler head on them. We're bringing the war home. We're going to spray it everywhere. And that is partly what led to this concern that Rachel has. So she wrote Silent Spring, but in 1945, she knew from government research at Patuxent in Maryland that there were health effects on humans from DDT and its metabolites that would cause long-range risks and health problems, including some kinds of cancers and other diseases. So she had started to freelance at that point. She suggested an article to the Reader's Digest, and since there are a few mature citizens in the audience, at least when I was younger, I used to read the Reader's Digest, and laughter is the best medicine, humor and anyone remember the Reader's Digest? Anyhow, 1945, Rachel calls up the Reader's Digest and says, I have been reading some excellent research from the Patuxent Library and Research Center in Maryland that indicates there are serious long-range health consequences with DDT. Editor of Reader's Digest? Boring. Not interested. So it took until there was a crisis, basically, with robins dying, ospreys, eagles, their shells thinning so they couldn't reproduce, that led Rachel Carson to write Silent Spring in 1962. That is what she is best known for, and it is what sort of her reputation rests on. I wrote this book, Rachel Carson and Her Sisters, Extraordinary Women Who Shaped America's Environment, which is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Actually, we had hoped to have some outside, but the books didn't get from the publisher in time. But I'll give you the routine anyhow. I wrote this book because I was inspired by Rachel Carson, for some of the reasons I've begun to outline, but also because I thought there were some serious myths about her that needed to be dispelled and that tie into the notion of what's going on here at Elon. You have a great administration and leaders. Let's say Leo Lambert. He caused it all. That's why you have all of these wonderful things going on. Well, he would tell you, other people might tell you, no. We stand on the shoulders of giants. There's an entire book on the development of Elon and how it has taken generation after generation, decade after decade. Of course, leadership is important, but it is involved with a whole set of faculty. When I met with President Lambert and I said, how in the world did you get a strategic plan that included sustainability? Did you do that from the top? And he said, no. There were people all around, faculty, staff, students, interested and involved. And that's part of the problem with the myth of Rachel Carson. She is seen as the exception, the great woman. One book changed history. She wrote a book, and poof, there was an environmental movement. Not even close to the truth. Here she's sitting up on Hawk Mountain birding, looking at hawks in Pennsylvania, in a sort of Olympian pose. But what this photo doesn't show is that she's not alone on the mountaintop. This pose we associate with great leaders. Moses, been to the mountaintop. Martin, I have been to the mountaintop. I may not get there with you. Rachel on the mountaintop. We know that each of these figures were surrounded by followers, by their fellow citizens, by their lieutenants, by people from all over who were a movement that did these things, not just one great lone person. It's also the case that this picture doesn't show who else is on the mountain. Somebody took the picture. Her best friend, colleague, Shirley Briggs, who started the Rachel Carson Council, who when Rachel died, continued the work and with others wrote books on pesticides, helped to save peregrine falcons and eagles and ospreys. It wasn't Rachel Carson. She had died. Other people went on after her. And this myth, it seems to me, was made worse when Silent Spring came out. Rachel had had 3 best-selling books, all on the New York Times bestseller list for nearly 2 years. That's why I wave my book around, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, whatever you would like. I still have a goal, but we're not getting there. But part of the reason it sold so much was a plan for women in Washington who did a launch, a big Washington launch. Agnes Meyer, the head of the Washington Post, Rachel's good friend and colleague, her literary agent, Marie Rodell. The conservative publishers, Houghton Mifflin, didn't want a Washington launch. That would be too political. So at a luncheon that included Frances Perkins, you all know, of course, was the first woman cabinet member, Secretary of Labor for FDR, head of the Washington Post. A women's power lunch is what helped to launch her book toward bestsellerdom. She also had blurbs that I would die for. Let's test the undergraduates here. Anyone? Anyone? William O. Douglas. Who is William O. Douglas? It's so, I'm sorry, how could you possibly know? Anyhow, Supreme Court Justice, but importantly for these purposes, written a number of books on wilderness, a hiker, an outdoorsman. He helped create the C&O Canal National Park outside Washington, where he walked for 140 miles, leaving reporters and important people in the dust. Most of them dropped out, to convince them that this place needed to be saved. And he wrote a blurb for the Book of the Month Club for Silent Spring that said, "This is a revolutionary book. You must read this book. It will change your life." Not since Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin has there been such a book. Well, you all remember what Abe Lincoln said when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe in the White House during the Civil War? "So you're the little lady that started it all." Somebody gets extra credit about that row, exactly. Well, it's the same myth and problem. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote an incredibly popular novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in 1850. It didn't start the anti-slavery movement, the abolition movement. The slaves knew they were enslaved. There had been slave resistance. The abolitionists Quakers and Unitarians and a few oddball lecturers had been at it for an awful long time. What Harriet Beecher Stowe did was write books that reached the educated, growing middle class that could buy and read books, who hadn't seen slavery, hadn't cared about it, hadn't known about it much. And it broadened the circle, and it was that engagement with audiences and reaching out to them with great writing, with social responsibility, lifelong learning, that helped further build a movement. But when Rachel Carson came to testify before the Senate, guess what? Senator Abe Ribicoff of Connecticut, head of the Environment Committee, calls her in to testify. They've all seen the blurb from Justice William O. Douglas. She steps to the mic, and what does Senator Ribicoff say? So you're the little lady that started it all. He didn't sound like Lincoln, but anyhow. This myth that Rachel Carson started the modern environmental movement is something I want particularly you undergraduates to understand is not the way history works, is not the way change works, is not the way movements or environmental movements are built. They grow on a long line of, in this case, women for 100 years before Rachel Carson, and organizations, and scientists, and professors, and teachers, all of whom make this kind of history happen. I want to surprise you. So that's what Rachel Carson is. I forgot to tell you one other thing I just want to share, because I was alive during the Kennedy administration. There, I've said it out loud. Isn't that amazing? In fact, I was old during. I'm still looking to sell my book. So this book was so powerful, and this is part of the myth, that when there's a press conference, John F. Kennedy's there, a reporter says, Mr. President, there's been a lot of talk about pesticides. You're going to do anything about that? And he says, you must be talking about Miss Carson's book. We've looked into that. We'll be forming a task force to look into that. I was like, can you imagine the sales? But what actually went on, the other part of the myth I want you to understand about Rachel Carson is sometimes people say she wasn't political. Okay, and this is where you all hate politics, right? Washington's corrupt, the Congress is broken, it's all filled with money, nothing can happen, young people, why bother? It appeared that way also when Rachel Carson started Silent Spring. Her favorite candidate, who was an environmentalist named Adlai Stevenson, had just been buried. The Eisenhower administration was frankly undoing all of the environmental stuff that had happened during the New Deal and after with FDR. And I mentioned the burning rivers and the smoke and all of that stuff. It didn't look terribly promising at the time. But she kept at it for all of those reasons that we've been talking about. And that is, hopefully, it's what has inspired me, will continue to inspire you. I want to tell you a couple of little-known facts about Rachel Carson and move quickly to our present time. Today, at Elon, North Carolina, and around. Okay, the test, review. Rachel Carson, famous writer, but she had help. She stood on the shoulders of giants. She had religious values, social responsibility, engaged learning, and a mixture of impeccable science and feeling and imagination. If you have imagination, English majors, without the science, it's hard to understand the modern world. I know you can learn about the sea from Locksley Hall, but it helps to put the two together. Scientists, I know you're wonderful people. Some of my best friends are scientists. But I could have been a scientist. No, never mind. Anyhow, you've got to put these things together and meld them into one approach grounded in values and learning and citizenship. So, Rachel Carson is known for chemicals, DDT, pesticides. Is that it? I have to tell you quickly How many of you knew that Rachel Carson was the leading anti-nuclear person? Or how many did not know that? Let's try that. And how many of you now will no longer read Silent Spring because Rachel Carson was opposed to nuclear weapons? One of the groups I ran, Susie, thank you, for Physicians for Social Responsibility, got its Nobel Peace Prize for opposing nuclear weapons. Why it took thousands of doctors to explain to you that one nuclear weapon can ruin your health, I'm still not, I sort of look back and I'm like, what? Anyhow, so there we are. Rachel Carson was friends with Roger Revelle. There, that explains it. Right? Roger Revelle, anyone? We may have to test the faculty on this one, I don't know. I was just out at University of California, San Diego. They have a Revelle College. Roger Revelle. Oh, undergraduates, look. This is why we have lifelong learning, and they could tell me stuff I've never even heard of. So this is the process in which we figure these things out. Roger Revelle was a noted oceanographer. He was at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography out in San Diego, UCSD. During World War II, he became the head of naval research on the oceans. Rachel Carson was studying the oceans, all knew and corresponded and read all of the great oceanographers, including Roger Revelle. He happened to be a guy who was charged with doing studies and experiments on what would happen to plants, animals, and other things when they were hit by nuclear weapons. So in 1946, you remember Operation Crossroads, where we tethered excess naval ships at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific and blew up an atomic bomb under them and dropped another one from a B-29 down on them to sort of see what would happen. Rachel Carson and Roger Revelle were involved in those studies, and the results are not pretty. Let's put it that way. She and other biologists were opposed to open-air nuclear testing because they had studied and seen and understood firsthand what this meant to people, animals, marine life, and the like. She spent a lifetime concerned about that issue. She rewrote the introduction to The Sea Around Us, her biggest bestseller in 1951. She reissued it in 1963 when her cancer was metastasizing, and in it, she wrote about the problems of nuclear fallout, strontium-90, and her concern and how we had measured this up in the Arctic zones with what we then called Eskimos and mothers, and how it was that the radiation and strontium-90 and other byproducts went through the ecosystems, bioaccumulated, ended up far, far from where we were testing nuclear weapons and affecting people up at that level. That's called global citizenship and a concern for Inuit, Eskimo mothers and children, as well as the 250,000 American GIs who trained under exploding nuclear weapons, and I know none of you know that. Is anyone in the ROTC? Anyhow. That's a piece of what Rachel Carson was interested in. It's part of why she was interested in John F. Kennedy. That was her candidate. She worked closely with Kennedy, the Kennedy administration. She was not apolitical. Those task forces that the president talked about, she was part of them. She and others worked with Stuart Udall, the Secretary of the Interior, and his chief of staff, a guy named Paul Knight. They worked on legislation, speeches, lobbying. Rachel Carson was deeply involved in that, and she favored the comprehensive nuclear test ban that John F. Kennedy wanted and gave his best speech in June of 1962 at American University, calling for an end to the Cold War, an end to nuclear testing. Unfortunately, as you know, JFK was assassinated, and Rachel Carson died of breast cancer, and so it fell to others to carry on that legacy from generation to generation, and we're frankly still at it. Another thing that astounds me, this worried me, I almost gave up on Rachel Carson. If you think nuclear weapons is bad, She was an animal rights person. I mean, yeah. My mother, also now deceased, wonderful woman, happened to have, this is the old days, she had mink coats, okay? And I swore, if somebody from PETA came up with a spray can and attacked my mom because she had on a mink coat, I would do nasty things to them. As the head of Physicians for Social Responsibility, I also got outpourings of emails. They would erupt. Every couple of months, my email would just go, you killer, you maniac, you're a bad person, because Physicians for Social Responsibility wouldn't take a stand against killing lab rats and mice to try to find out what the effects of drugs, chemicals, and others on human beings. We, like others, were searching for alternatives. It's not like we like, killing mice. But Rachel Carson, and more seriously, and this also relates to North Carolina, she was nearly dead and wrote the introduction to a book in 1964 called Animal Machines by Ruth Harrison, the first and leading author, a British woman, to talk about and expose the horrors of factory farming of cattle, hogs, chickens, what we now call CAFOs. I think there are some in North Carolina. Do I have that right? Do you produce any hogs here in North Carolina? Here's a test for you. I just learned this because I'm still learning. And I got here and I figured this out and I learned it. I'm very proud. Okay. Have you heard of Smithfield? Bacon, sausage. Who owns Smithfield? The Chinese. I'm not sure that the CAFOs would be better or worse owned by Americans or Chinese, but when I discovered that those nice little Smithfield packages in this, I'd love to see what would happen if they had Chinese lettering across the top and see how many people, anyhow. More seriously, many of you have been around for the hurricane in 1996, at least when I first became aware of large numbers of dead hogs, rotting, things spilling out over the North Carolina landscape. This is a problem that Rachel Carson would have been deeply concerned with. She also would have been concerned, because of her interest in nuclear waste and nuclear weapons and nuclear power, with Fukushima. And she would have been concerned in places in South Carolina where they have a combined coal-fired utility and nuclear power plant that has been mixing coal ash and low-level radioactive waste into one messy problem. And so I think she'd have been interested in that. And finally, the subject that I really have spent most of my time on, which is global climate change. Well, someone asked me if Rachel Carson cared about climate change. Thank you, Reverend. Did Rachel Carson care about climate change? Answer. Okay, let's see. She died in 1964. What do you think? Can we get a lifeline poll the audience? What is it? Al Gore hadn't done his thing yet. Absolutely right. Okay. You remember Roger Revelle? This is on the final. Roger Revelle was a leading scientist, was involved with testing of nuclear weapons, government contracts. 1957 was the International Geophysical Year, where scientists wanted to learn more about global issues and cooperate. Suffice to say, he got a bunch of grants, hired a guy named Charles Keeling, a technologically and environmentally savvy guy, to run and build atop Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii, a facility that measures CO2 concentrations in the air. Okay. Now you recall that Rachel Carson was friends with Roger Revelle. You should know that he wrote an early report Conservation Federation that Rachel read, that the Kennedy administration read, that the measurements now beginning at Mauna Loa were showing that the warming that scientists had already measured might be related to the rising levels of CO2 that they were measuring. And there was concern in the Kennedy White House. They went ahead and held a conference on this subject, made statements on global climate change back then, and Rachel Carson was aware of all of this because she knew Revelle, she knew the Kennedy administration, she read the reports. Of course, at the time, they were measuring from 306 to 308 parts per million of carbon dioxide that goes up in the atmosphere, and that's, as it gets more concentrated, that's what blocks infrared heat coming back towards space. Solar radiation goes in, warms up the Earth. Help me, science faculty. And we learned in 19th century chemistry that CO2 coal gas was the experiment in England, blocks heat. And so the planet gets warmer and warmer, and that begins to melt the ice, lead to more precipitation, et cetera. But we're now at over 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, and some scientists tell us that anything beyond 350 could lead to disastrous consequences that would be practically irreversible. There are others who say maybe up to 450. Both environmentalists, activists, and scientists love to argue about these numbers, but the fact is we're already at a level that has begun to show serious signs of global climate change now. And I don't need to lead you through the California drought, the changes in climate patterns that we're seeing, rising sea levels along the shores, North Carolina included, Florida in particular. And Rachel Carson, I believe, would have been quite active in this area. When you put together her interests in air pollution, water pollution, if you're reading Silent Spring, you know that she's concerned about where the chemicals go and so on. She surely would have been interested in, and I think concerned about, and trying to end fracking. Suffice to say, she would have looked at the science that no matter how you burn natural gas, and it's clearly more efficient and better than coal, but it's not as good as the Elon bio-buses. I wanted to hop on one, but it left me in the dust, and I thought, biofuels, et cetera. But fracking has a number of problems. It's already shown that we don't know all of the chemicals that are in the water, and that's where it's important, and Rachel Carson would have wanted to know exactly. She would have wanted people to have to report what kind of chemicals are there so we can know what the risks are. She would have been aware what happens when you drive water, chemicals, sand, blast it down a couple of miles below the earth to break up the shale formation to release natural gas, the problems that come with that. She would have been aware, as you probably are, that there are indeed increased earthquakes in the areas where there's heavy fracking. And finally, of course, when you burn natural gas, you get CO2 up into the atmosphere, and it makes global climate change increasingly bad. This might give you an idea also of why Rachel Carson was seen as somewhat controversial in her day. We tend to take these people on the covers of books and idealize them later. Martin Luther King has a holiday. Rachel Carson has many things named after her. But of course, she was attacked wildly. She was called a communist. The worst slur of all, more mature members of the audience may understand, they called her a spinster. I think it's something like a San Francisco liberal, but I'm not sure. She had many women friends. She was not married. And one of her opponents said publicly, "How can a woman without children tell us about the future?" So it wasn't just a happy little turn out a book and so on. It required a great deal of courage and conviction and a concern for citizenship, global citizenship, that for Rachel, she told her closest friend, Dorothy Freeman, who lived up in Maine where Rachel had a summer home. She said, you know, I partly do what I do. And then she quoted Abe Lincoln. And since I am not Abe Lincoln, you remember that Lincoln said, to sin by silence when we should protest makes cowards out of men. She felt she could not remain silent in the face of all of this. And that kind of approach came from her engaged, inspirational, citizen-driven Presbyterian grandfather, her mother, the women who came before her, her inspired teachers and mentors at college, both in English and biology, and others in graduate school, and those who came along the way, and her friends and colleagues who supported her as she was under attack while dying of breast cancer. That is why, for me, Rachel Carson is truly an inspiration, not just an icon, not just a book we assign in an interdisciplinary class, but a woman who lived her life by the values that you are privileged to have here at Elon University, emblazoned in your slogans, in your buildings, in your bio carts, in your bio buses, in the faculty that you have, inspired teachers. All I ask of you is that, like Rachel Carson, you seek your deepest values, use your imagination and feeling for others, for creatures, and then don't be afraid to speak out, to be silent. That's what Silent Spring is really about. Rachel wanted to break the silence. And so I want to close with just a little piece of the only commencement address that Rachel Carson ever gave at Scripps College for Women in California. And in it, she talks about my generation. Okay. This speech was given in 1962. I was alive at Yale University at the time. Rachel Carson spoke to my generation quite strongly, but I think the messages, the values, the feeling, the responsibility are the same for yours. So if you listen to what she said as Scripps and perhaps substitute Elon, this is what Rachel Carson would have to say to you. Your generation must come to terms with the environment. Your generation must face realities instead of taking refuge in ignorance and evasion of truth. Yours is a grave and sobering responsibility, but it's also a shining opportunity. You go out into a world where mankind is challenged as it has never been challenged before to prove its maturity and its mastery, not of nature, but of itself. Therein lies our hope and our destiny. In today, graduates of Elon, already walks tomorrow. You are our hope. I have tried to follow in that path. I hope to continue to do it as long as I have breath and can stand and can speak. And I will walk beside you, teach, write, as long as I can, and try to help you on a journey that never ends, because these subjects will never go away. And so I charge you as we go out tonight, as the organ is playing, to commit your lives to the environment, to the values of Elon, of Rachel Carson, presumably of your parents or professors or someone who has touched your life about engaged learning, inspired leadership, and global citizenship. It's all we can ask of ourselves. Thank you. Oh, yeah. I have a few. Did I touch the mic? Did I just knock it off or something? Can you hear me? Or maybe they cut, as Ronald Reagan said, I paid for this mic. No, I'm sorry. Yeah. Questions, comments? We have a microphone here. You can jump up and say, you lie, or ask me whatever you would like. Hi. Uh-oh. This looks like a hard question.
No, not really. What made you want to focus on the women that came before Rachel Carson rather than just the entire environmental community?
Okay. Why did I want to focus on women rather than the entire environmental community?
I think it's a good thing. I like support it.
No. Could you? I just wasn't sure whether. Can you hear from this mic? Okay. Let's see. First of all, I ran a rather large environmental health group for a long time before I thought I was going to semi-retire and just write books and teach and lecture and so on. And then it turned out that the Rachel Carson Council was looking for a leader because their longtime one had stopped. They didn't have enough money to hire a young, zippy 42-year-old. So I said, I know about Rachel Carson. I do these things. Maybe we could do. That's what I got there. So why Rachel Carson? While I was running PSR, what we called it, it's part of 35 large national organizations that meet together and plot strategy in Washington. Is how I got to talk to Clinton or Obama, et cetera. Not because I'm so charming. Well, anyhow. But because you organize and you represent, those groups I just named represent perhaps 18 million dues-paying Americans between the groups. Some of you may belong to some of them or multiple groups. So I would go out and speak and people would say, oh, you're one of those men who runs all those groups and you all were wealthy and went to Yale and you're just disgusting. They were mostly male leadership. I got asked frequently. I was well aware of the problem. Many of the groups were founded by men who were my contemporaries. And I didn't want to say, well, they're going to die and retire soon. It'll change. As seriously, my wife, who's a leading national figure in women's studies, as a raving, wonderful second-wave feminist, and my daughters wanted to know more about women. And so I would go out and lecture, and I'd want to talk to women's studies groups, but I couldn't just talk about John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt and David Brower. So I developed a couple of lectures about women in the environment movement, and some of them were contemporary friends of mine who are in the back chapters. These are women that if you buy the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and whatever, you can see are combined writing, feeling, science, advocacy, action. And so I started talking about them and I got a good response and I wanted to know more. And I presumed, given what I've said about the nature of movements, civil rights, et cetera, that there was more than I knew before Rachel Carson. And then I discovered her mother and her Presbyterian grandfather that struck a little chord, and I started going backwards. So I also thought it was important to, we've made tremendous progress in medicine, in STEM, in women getting interested in science and all that, but it still is not what it should be. I counsel and mentor lots of young women who are not so sure they want to go to medical school. Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't. I had lots of staff members, young women, who weren't even sure they wanted to get a master's in public health because it involved biostatistics and they didn't like math. This is now, I'm not talking back in the day. So I wanted to provide also some sort of examples and inspiration and show that there was this line of women who had faced huge obstacles. Oh, it's so exciting when you read that book. So that's another piece of the reason. I mean, that's about as good as I could do without going on all night, which I can do, I'm sorry. No controversial questions. No, sir. Oh, yep.
Well, mine's more of a musing than a question. But when you talked about the task force in Washington that were studying the dangers of all of this,
Yes.
what were they thinking and how were they reacting when our government was spraying Vietnam, Mekong Delta with Agent Orange? That's just amusing.
Yeah. Excellent question. A couple of things happened on every front. And if we picture what we're talking about now, Agent Orange, most of you, but not all of you know, we sprayed herbicides through a thing called Operation Ranch Hand to get rid of the cover in Vietnam so we could more effectively shoot at the enemy, who would hide. I mentioned global climate change, which they were aware about and starting to talk about. The chemical thing. And I mentioned that John died, and when the Vietnam War came along, it overshadowed most of these things, and Lyndon Johnson and his advisors became obsessed with the war, and things like the Interior Department and the environment just were much lower priorities. There also are always divisions within the government, within bureaucracies, in which some people think is a problem and other people say no. That happened in the Department of Agriculture over the chemicals I'm talking about. There were differences. So that's part of the reason. It's also why Rachel Carson worked very heavily and hard trying to get a Department of the Environment, as had people in the FDR's day. Harold Ickes, who some of you may know wrote a secret diary, who was one of FDR's confidants, was a leading environmentalist and worked with another woman I don't have time to tell you about named Rosalie Edge, and they were like an inside-outside game of stirring up the environment. But Ickes wanted a Department of Conservation. Same thing was true. We were headed that way in the Kennedy administration, and poof, the Vietnam War pretty much obliterated all of that. And that's why, to oversimplify things, that Richard Nixon gets the credit for being the president who signed into law the Environmental Protection Agency. But like all of these stories, the president who signed it, and at least Richard Nixon, was sophisticated enough to understand the environmental problems and that it would help him politically at the time to sign it. He deserves credit. But too many times in a quick course, they'll say, oh, did you know who started the EPA? It was a Republican president, Richard Nixon. Well, no. It has a history of people pushing from below, within the administrations. The war interrupts. We saw the exact same thing with Iraq. It interrupted a whole lot of stuff. And so the Al Gore thing, just to use an example, got interrupted, and Al Gore was attacked in ways that Rachel Carson was. He didn't really invent the internet. By the way, is it true or false? Did Al Gore invent the internet? It's true. Just because he's a friend of mine, I know. Here's the story. I'm digressing, but forgive me. Have you heard of DARPA? Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where we do all our secret, high-tech, highly paid defense projects. Al pushed for and provided the appropriations to fund a project to link military computers around the world so they could communicate with each other so we could run our operations more effectively, and hence the World Wide Web was born. Obviously, he didn't invent it, and he never said that. So it's sort of one of these little urban myths. One other Al Gore fact I should tell you. When he was at Harvard, 1966, do you know who his professor was? Who taught him about climate change? Roger Revelle. Al Gore has known the science of climate change in detail from the people who studied it first, who warned about it first, since he was an undergraduate at Harvard. He held his first hearings on climate change when he was a congressman in 1981. When he was a senator in 1988, he held hearings with Tim Wirth that the leading scientists from NASA, the space guys, the Goddard Space Center, said in 1988, and I put it on my radio program. Remember you said I did radio. I hate video and television. I'm not tall and thin enough, but radio's cool. Sorry. But in this particular case, Jim Hansen is his name, testified to the Senate and said, global climate change is real, it's caused by humans, we're 90-some-odd% certain, and we need to do something about it. Now, he lost some Department of Energy contracts, and he was attacked internally, but part of our understanding of all this, as with Rachel Carson, is affected by political blowback, by people who have some interest in things that we might consider bad, and they go up and down. And that's why I don't want to tell you what to think or believe about global climate change. I want you to study with these folks and be inspired by them, to read on your own, yes, to stay up late, as Rachel Carson did, and figure out what in hell is going on. Is it true or isn't it true? What's the science? Why don't people pay attention if the science is true, and then do something about it? Simple. I like Al Gore jokes too. Remember the old Macarena jokes? Yeah, all right, never mind. I don't want to lapse into nostalgia. Are we about done? We have time for, I'm like Bill Clinton. I'll stay here all night, bring in some pizza. And, it's just, you had your hand up. I'm sorry.
So on the subject of fracking, do you believe that the risks outweigh the benefits? Because we have seen tremendous growth in oil production in the last 5 years.
Yeah. The simple answer is no. It also is local. It depends on the economy. I made jokes earlier about North Dakota, where there's a lot of, and then there was a woman in the audience from North Dakota, and I didn't even know people lived there. In Pennsylvania, that I know much more seriously, I've worked with the governors, environmental people. You will discover that anyone who runs for office in Pennsylvania is much more cautious about fracking, though, of course, if you talk to them offline, they don't like it. They don't like coal. However, the economy of Pennsylvania depends a fair amount on it, and so they talk about studies, controlling it, making sure this concrete is strong enough, et cetera. But the economy is roughly, I'll just assert, there's no time, that the economy of the future depends upon renewables. There's been great and tremendous growth in solar and wind, geothermal, all of which you have here at Elon. That's why I said it is a beacon, it is a symbol. You are modeling the future, and it's a good investment. The university grows, you get better students, right? Students? Yeah, I have. So I think the long-range economic growth is clearly in renewables, and the old economy is just getting harder and more expensive to squeeze it out of tar sands, frack it out of, and it can't go on. We need to find a transition, however. I would be the first to say, and I'm sure Rachel Carson would, because she did not call for an immediate ban on every single chemical. She wanted people to understand how dangerous, who's it hurting, what do we replace it with? Same with fracking. If we just turned off everything tomorrow, we'd have no lights, the economy would boom, but it's got to go pretty quickly.
On
You do know Al Gore. What would... Okay, you heard the question. She's concerned about thinning eggs in Silent Spring. What would she think about the effects of chemicals and so on turning frogs into hermaphrodites? I'm glad you asked, because the 4 women in the back of my book and I have all been concerned about a number of things, including what is called endocrine disruption, which some policymakers in Washington think it's an environmental plot. These are exposures of chemicals. They're so tiny you can barely even know that it's there. And it took us a very long time and a lot of research and writing by one of the women in my book called Theo Colburn, who wrote a book called Our Stolen Future that popularized the idea that these chemicals, it didn't depend on the dose like classic toxicology. It depended on the timing of the exposure in utero, whether for mice or women, and that it could disrupt the developmental process. And a tiny little endocrine disrupting chemical which mimics the endocrine system screws it up. It bends gender bending, no joke. And so those of you who wish to know more can read Theo Colburn, Sandra Steingraber, who I think spoke here last fall. These are a number of women involved in these issues. I think it would have been top on Rachel Carson's list. With the frogs, I should add, is extremely complex. I think you all know they're in danger, and I love frogs. From when I first saw Kermit. There's lots of possibilities, and they get diseases, there's chemicals, there's changes in the environment, there's warming, but it's pretty clear that what you say is going on. So, but that's why you're here at Elon. I am impressed. President Lambert, you take credit for this young generation here, that you know about, gender bent, hermaphroditic. That's 2 sexes in one, for those of you who haven't studied. I first learned about this with hermaphroditic beluga whales up in Canada. I thought I had gone to the ends of the earth. I'm a bird watcher, don't beat me up, please. I'm a little looking for the birds and whales in the St. Lawrence, where it gets huge and the Saguenay River pours into it, and you can see blue whales out in the deep parts of the St. Lawrence, and you can see the belugas. And I'm talking to a naturalist park ranger in 1982, and he says, we couldn't even bury those cute little whales. They're so full of toxic chemicals. PCBs from hydroelectric plants up in northern Quebec. And then we get into the hermaphroditic belugas. I saw them in the Baltimore Aquarium. They're so cute. And it is related to these kinds of exposures, and it's going on around the world, and it's... the answer, by the way, in Europe, I'm always sorry to say, they've moved ahead of us in environmental and scientific things. They use what's called the precautionary principle. Basically, chemicals are guilty until proven innocent. And here they're innocent until proven guilty. So there are a number of things where there's clear signs, at least scientifically real, that there could be danger. Some of us advocate that you don't want to wait until all the frogs are gone or until you have the very last study that shows it was exactly this chemical, but take some precautionary move. Extra credit right there. And I'll tell Al Gore that. All right, I think, as I warned you, that you were just this, it has been inspiring and a privilege for me to be at Elon, seriously. And I could go through the classes and the professors, the administration, and the gorgeous campus. Oh my God. I keep thinking, this is what the University of Virginia must have looked like when Thomas Jefferson was alive. I mean, the trees weren't old yet, but I don't even know how you do it. Leeds buildings that look like the old part of the University of Virginia. I mean, that's meant to be a compliment, but it's just like, wow. So I hope you appreciate what you got, even just walking around, leaving aside sustainability, inspired leaders, engaged learning, and global citizenship. You're at the right place. Thank you for having me talk with you. It's been great.